got one?
But
Just wait till Simon's finished. Okay, everyone, it's 7 o'clock, so we will open tonight's briefing session. So welcome everyone, welcome everybody who is here joining us this evening. And to start with, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nations, and to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I would also just like to bring people's attention to the fact that our sessions are recorded and live streamed on the internet in an effort to improve transparency and inclusivity for our community. Jai is saying hello. The first thing on the agenda then is attendances and apologies. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to introduce Mr. Philip Adams, who's our Acting Manager of Assets, if that's correct. And we also have Deanie Carvin, who's sitting down the back there, who is our Corporate Communications Officer. So some of you may not have had a chance to meet those two staff members yet, so welcome and thank you for being here. And we have an apology from Councillor Gangel this evening. Next we have deputations, and this evening we have Mr. Nigel Hindmarsh, who's the Director of Business Development from the Department of Communities. Nigel, I believe that you were here tonight to be able to speak to us about item 6.1, so is that chair for Nigel? If you'd like to come up and sit next to Melissa, that would be great. So, for those who are in attendance, item 6.1 is the report on the potential establishment of a memorandum of understanding between the Department of Communities and the town of Bassendean. So I don't know whether you had anything you wanted to present, Nigel, or whether you were just making yourself available for councillors to ask questions.
Perhaps a general comment, if I may, to begin with, and thank you very much for the opportunity to attend tonight to talk about it. So the Department of Communities, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the Department of Communities, we were formed last year as a result of the McGowan State Government merging of departments. So the Housing Authority, or Department of Housing, as many people who have known it, were joined together with a number of the human service agencies, and Department of Communities. All 6,500 of us is the beast that has appeared out of that. But Department of Communities has a very strong need to partner with local governments, and in my experience, often state government and local government want the same things, but we don't always talk the same language. So effectively, part of the rationale for the Memorandum of Understanding is to set out the ways in which we will collaborate and the opportunities to collaborate with local government, so that we can achieve our shared outcomes that we both want to achieve in our communities and in our local area. And for the Department of Communities, particularly now we have merged into this department, along with local government, we are effectively one of the only two bodies that remain in a community once development has been done. So we both have a very active interest in making sure we get it right and not make mistakes in the development that impact on the community long term and leave lingering effects. So the Memorandum of Understanding, and what we're hoping to do through this, is to effectively set out the framework through which we can collaborate, get agreement on the things that we jointly want to achieve, and really make the most of the opportunities that do exist to do so.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Nigel? Councillor Wilson.
thank you. So the sorts of parcels of land that those sorts of opportunities might be able to be realised on, are they solely state government owned parcels of land, or state government and town of Bassendean owned parcels of land, or do they include private land holdings as well?
So primarily the agreement talks about sharing of information on state government and town of Bassendean owned lands. Generally privately owned land can be a direct approach either to the town or to ourselves. The main purpose of this is really to look at opportunities for the town's assets and our own.
Are you familiar with the East Perth Redevelopment Authority model and the Royal Street development that happened about a decade ago?
I'm loosely familiar with it, yeah.
Okay. Does that model or models similar to that exist in the present state framework? Or?
So what was the Redevelopment Authority became the MRA, the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority. So They still have many of those same powers and planning powers that were put into place at that time. There are currently redevelopment areas, and you'll be familiar with things like Elizabeth Quay and East Perth still exists, Scarborough. And under Metronet, there may be a role for MRA around the Metronet train stations as well, for planning frameworks. Slightly different to the powers that we use, so we don't have the redevelopment and planning authority that they have. We generally have the commercial and development activity and ability to partner with the private sector.
So do you see or foresee that there may be some value in including the MRA or wherever that lives now within a group such as the ones proposed in this MOU?
Yeah, we separately have an MOU with the MRA already, so anywhere where there is an MRA redevelopment area identified by the WAPC, then we have a partnership with them and we have a role in providing affordable housing through various provisions that they have in their act. So whilst at the moment, and we do have MOUs with several local government authorities, we don't have a tripartite one with MRA, we do separately have a relationship and an agreement in place with them.
Okay. So I know we haven't received much of the detail yet about Metronet and some of the transit-oriented design development that might flow from that. Who would be the lead agency for those sorts of opportunities?
So as it stands at the moment in this early planning phase of Metronet, that's being led by the joint Metronet office, which includes ourselves, includes MRA, Landcorp, Transport, a number of different agencies working cross government. When decisions are made about what planning frameworks may be placed over particular station precincts, that will generally be an MRA lead for the planning framework. And then subsequent to that, anywhere that has government or local government land in there will be identified as an opportunity for a discussion around what the future of that may look like.
So do you foresee that those sorts of discussions will arise through this body created by the MOU, or would that happen outside of that?
No, I think this would be absolutely one of the ways in which that discussion will be facilitated. So once we're clear on what the planning framework around each individual station would be, the next step is that the delivery agencies, because Metronet has, in its own right, is not a delivery agency, it's just a coordination body. The delivery agencies, which is generally at state government level, ourselves and Landcorp, there will be decisions made over where the opportunities sit with state government land, with local government land, and indeed with the private sector, how they might be brought into that discussion as well. An MOU like this that already exists would definitely be seen as one of those ways in which we could facilitate the communication between Metronet and the local government.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Councillor Brown.
Thank you. Thanks. We have the three stations. Have you discussed prioritising your efforts in respect of, say, Ashfield, Bassendean and Success, or are you going to deal with the whole 3 kilometres of...
Yeah, no, it's a very early stage, so effectively this MOU opens up that conversation. Whilst we have had a discussion with members of the town already about opportunities that might exist in the future, really we need this in place to then actually talk about where your priorities as a town sit, where the state government's priorities in terms of, well, Metronet is the obvious one, but in terms of the community's outcomes that we want to achieve of diversity, affordability, etc., the housing typologies, and the sustainability outcomes that we want to achieve. That's the next stage from this. So no, there's been no priority set over individual sites or stations at the moment.
Councillor Hamilton.
So can I ask, in this process where community fit into like their input, because obviously that's fairly important to us.
Yeah.
It's actually very important to us as a council. So in this whole process, where does that fit in a schedule type scenario?
Yeah, so there's obviously the statutory ways that happens, which occurs at the moment. So any time where there's a planning framework change, there's an advertising to the community. More and more what we're trying to do though is get a much earlier engagement with the community about the design of what that statutory planning framework might look like, or what's important to the community. Now, it's always a challenge, of course, because you will have a very broad range of desires and needs from the community. So there'll always be a point at which you have to make decisions about which ones are most important to the town, to the community, to the state government, and you're going to have to get those decision points together, either through this body or through other bodies to do that. But and I do recognise and I understand that some of the history previously has been one where that process hasn't been transparent, and I recognise there'll be concerns about that. Part of the reason setting up this MOU is to allow us the opportunity to collaborate with the town, and then to establish when and where's the appropriate times to engage with the community to get the design right. Because at the end of the day, as I say, there's no point in us building something that's no use to the community, either for you or for us.
Councillor Quinton?
What other councils do you have an MOU with?
So we currently have MOUs with the City of Stirling. We have a number of regional MOUs, so Broome and Bunbury. We're currently in negotiations, we have Bayswater as an MOU. And we're currently in negotiations with a couple of others at the moment over setting up an MOU, like Joondalup, for instance, is one that we've seen.
And I remember when you were here earlier, we talked about future-proofing some of our affordable housing, and particularly in terms of maybe having apartments that won't have parking attached to it per se. And there was a risk that that might not be sellable or unsellable, and there would be a risk of the cost of that, and that we might not make any money, you might not make any money, and someone then has to take the cost of that. But at the same time, we want to make something that people want to buy.
Yep.
So how does that discussion happen between you and us in this context?
So there are a number of things that lead to a decision around car parking. Yes, marketability is definitely one of those. So our business model, the way that although we are state government departments, the way that we operate is in a commercial enterprise. So we need to be able to make it commercially viable at the end of the day. So it needs to sell. Having said that, and I think we showed a number of people present in the room today a development we did over in West Perth, where we worked with the local government to remove the car parking. We put Vespa scooter bays in. They were all the first units to sell there, right next to a train station. So we are certainly open to the discussion about future-proofing affordable housing, and what's incumbent in that is there is a significant reduction in the cost of the housing as a result of that, because car parking can cost quite a large proportion of the overall cost of your housing. But at the end of the day, it's got to be within the provisions of the local planning scheme, or there needs to be a recognition of why that's going to be negated. So it needs to be work between the town planning staff, probably with the involvement of the Department of Planning or WAPC if it needs a separate approval, and it needs to be commercially viable. So as part of designing up some solutions to these opportunities, that's part of the conversation, and it will be a conversation that also takes into account the sustainability measures that need to be put in, use of smart technologies to overcome that. So I've mentioned previously, one approach is actually to have car parking that isn't allocated to an individual apartment or unit, but you use number plate recognition and apps to be able to allocate those on a need basis. So there are smart ways that you can overcome that, and we are absolutely engaged in conversation at the moment about how we move away from this heavy dependence on individual car bays and spaces, because from our perspective, firstly, it's not sustainable, but it's also not affordable.
Councillor Appleton?
Okay. I am interested in the actual agreement, which is in the attachments, number 1. 4G indicates progress potential pilot or demonstration projects that deliver innovation in built form and housing outcomes. Obviously, that is something this town aspires to, but I'm interested in the potential conflict between delivering a project that is perhaps profitable as opposed to, because generally when you talk about potential pilot or demonstration projects that deliver innovation, there tends to be a conflict there between profit and what can and can't be done. So I'm curious about the conflict there and how that may be resolved.
Yeah, that's a very fair observation, and I think this is where the role of state government comes in. So if I was a private sector developer, then I would be relatively risk averse to innovation, particularly at this current point in the market. However, what we have the ability to do is to be able to use the size of our portfolio to manage those costs across the whole portfolio. And also to mitigate some of those risks on behalf of the private sector. So to give you an example, recently with our partners up in Ellenbrook, we developed the state's first micro lots, so lots under 100 square metres in size. It was something that the market wasn't prepared to do, and we were able to do that because we partnered, or we worked closely with Department of Planning on the planning provisions that allowed that to happen. We used the scale of our purchasing power with the builders to drive costs down. So the builder in that particular case, we have a long-standing relationship and a volume build agreement with, so we can drive some of those costs down. And also we can mitigate some of the other costs because as a government, state government department, there are various levers that we can pull. So it is a balance, and we will have to make case-by-case decisions about innovation. But one of our clear roles as state government is to help the market to go where it doesn't necessarily want to go if it's going to achieve outcomes on behalf of state, which include affordability as a key driver, but also more and more diversity of housing product. We still have largely a population where there's large over-occupancy in dwellings, and that's partly because there's a lack of supply from the market. So there are few areas in terms of our overall objectives where we will support and, if you like, underwrite the risk of innovation in order to achieve some of the outcomes that we need as behalf of the state.
The Department of Housing, as it was, Communities now, you also sell your products sometimes.
Yes.
So what would happen in that case if you wanted to sell something that we had built with you, or vice versa, we wanted to sell something? How would that work with you guys? Has that happened?
Yes, it has. So generally the way our model works is that it's usually preferential if through the arrangement the land title passes to the Department of Communities, because that's how we then leverage the private sector outcomes in partnering with them. What we can do then is pass on the outcomes in a number of ways. We can, once you've built units or apartments, you can pass those back to the town as part of the agreement. You could pass it back in terms of revenues or waterfall payments out of there. Or it might be a land swap that's done to enable other outcomes on behalf of the town. The other way it could be done, of course, and we've talked about this in terms of civic buildings and community facilities, is that some of the takeout for the town is in the form of a different form of community facility. There are all numbers of ways we can do it, is the short answer. But yeah, generally we need to get the commercial outcome to subsidise those social outcomes either on behalf of us or on behalf of the town.
Okay, again, coming back to a process question, I understand from the agreement and from the report, the officer's report, what is planned. My question is there opportunity in this process for input from councillors in ongoing workshops, so that before it becomes something that comes to council, that there is time and energy devoted to forming some of these ideas, because there's diversity of ideas in the community. We represent the community, and also there are other community members in some of our committees that may have skill sets and have input as well. So my question is that a normal thing that you might consider including in this process, so that there is an ongoing gain of information as we go along, which forms the destination?
The short answer is yes. So to give an example recently of some of the community engagement that we have done, we will usually get to a point where there's a 70% design, if you like. just so we've got a start point for a conversation. Now, to get to that point, we'll usually have an initial community engagement, and when I say community engagement, that includes both the elected representatives and the broader community through a variety of methods, whether that be surveys. I understand you've had some really good work done by Alan Tranter at creating communities recently that could contribute to that sort of conversation. So that would inform basically the principles on which we'd do a design. We'd then come back with a design and say, does this actually fulfil some of the requirements that you're looking at, before we got to a DA and a statutory approvals process. But I think it's really down to the town how you want to engage with us through this memorandum, and who you want to have effectively representing you on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I spoke before about priorities. Ashfield almost lends itself to being a priority given its proximity to Perth and the land available. One of my major concerns is that Ashfield houses something like 16% or 15% public housing, and I'm concerned that they will be dislodged or disrupted during this process, particularly if Perth PL 3.5 is your guiding document. A lot of these people live on wonderful old established families live on big blocks. Have you got that in your thinking when you? I've seen some of the plans for Ashfield, some of the previous plans. Like I said, my major concern is a lot of these families that live there for generations are likely to be dislodged or disrupted or come under stress.
Yeah, that's a very fair point, and it's probably one of those areas where we can't operate as a private sector developer, and nor would we want to. You know, our tenants are very much part of our core business, so we still have a very clear need to provide state subsidised housing for the most disadvantaged. So that's not going to go away, and we're certainly not in the business of removing the supply of social housing from an area. What we do try to do is make sure that we get an appropriate mix for the area of social housing, private sector housing, affordable housing, the broad range, because unlike many other states, we have a policy where we believe that a true social mix is the most beneficial approach. Many other states take the approach that they concentrate all of their social housing in one area. That's not the approach that we take with new development. So whenever we go into a new development, we will work out what's the need in the area, both for our own housing stock, more affordable housing stock, but equally premium stock as well, because the greater diversity of a community that you can create, the more vibrant I think that community becomes.
I absolutely agree with that, and Ashfield I think is the leading suburb of social housing with that 15 or 16%. The mix works well. Like I said, I wouldn't want those families to come under stress, particularly when people start eyeing off their quarter-acre blocks with this Perth PL 3.5 as a guiding principle.
Councillor Hamilton?
That comment by Councillor Brown has now brought me to another thought. Given that we do have a very high percentage in Ashfield, particularly of a certain demographic of type of housing, I think my question is there, you've talked about a variety of housing, is there shared equity involved in this? Okay.
Yeah, so we use the term affordable housing quite broadly, and I think often it's misconstrued as predominantly social housing, but our mandate as Department of Communities was housing is to provide housing solutions for everything up to moderate income earners. So we actually cater quite a broad spectrum, and you would have seen recently announcements about Key Start further expanding their income eligibility. So we are talking really about everybody from the most disadvantaged who need to access heavily subsidised government state housing, all the way up to young graduate nurses, teachers, policemen, the key components of the community. It's that whole spectrum, and shared equity is one of the mechanisms by which we can deliver that affordability.
It was just curiosity because I don't believe we have very much shared equity in the district. So I was curious about whether that was something that you're focusing on as a mainframe or not. So, but obviously your scope is quite broad in this.
Yeah, it's always a consideration. It varies by area because effectively you only use shared equity where the natural market prices are such that that cohort cannot access housing. So it will vary across Perth, and it will vary in terms of the proportions of equity that the state government takes up in those. But certainly in all of the developments that I've seen in this area recently, the new ones that have come through, there's always been 2 or 3 shared equity as a minimum in there. So only on new properties, we can't operate on established properties, obviously, that are being sold. But it's a pretty standard part of our mix of housing there.
Okay.
Any other questions? Thank you, Nigel. That was really informative, and we appreciate you being here again tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, item 4 is declarations of interest.
Yes, you wish to declare proximity interest on
6.7.
item 6.7.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Any others? Alright, in that case we'll move on to item 5, which is statements by members of the public. So if there's anybody present who would like to come forward and make a statement about any of the items on tonight's agenda, now is your chance. So if you can just raise your hand and I'll call you in turn. Yes, Lisa. You can probably just tip it down, I think, isn't it?
Very good, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa Last, 82B West Road. I'm here representing the Verge Transformation Project. I just wanted to make a comment that obviously the draft policy is out. I've reviewed it and I just wanted to thank everyone who's been involved in improving the policy, because I think it's really good. It reads very well and it includes pretty much all of the things that we were talking about to make a great policy, and I'm very excited about the changes that will hopefully be happening in our town and beyond because of the changes to the policy. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Clive.
Madam Mayor and councillors, my name is Clive Brown. I represent the Bassendean Community Men's Shed Incorporated. Item 6.3 on the council agenda this evening concerns the provision of a men's shed with the appropriate funding provided. As we don't get the opportunity to participate in the debate, and assuming that the council is in fact going to pass this resolution, which I hope after 11 years will be the case, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank council, all councillors and council officers for supporting this project. Men's sheds around Australia are the fastest growing social community organisations in Australia, which demonstrates a real need. And right across Australia we're seeing men's sheds develop as more people retire and as more men need places to go to socialise and to be part of organisations that provide both health support and moral support for men. And this has been recognised by governments of all political colours in the fact that they have supported financially and morally the development of men's sheds right across Australia. In Western Australia now there are 180 men's shed groups or men's sheds, and the number is expanding. A number of men's sheds have now closed their books because they can no longer take any additional members. They have reached a capacity and in some instances have 60, 80 or 100 people on the waiting list waiting to become members of the men's shed. Already now, because word has leaked out in the community about the prospect of getting a men's shed, even though we don't have a shed that currently is on offer. We are already finding more people coming to our meetings and more interest. So our capacity, our capacity in going forward is not a question as to whether the men's shed will be utilised. It is a question of how many people we will be able to eventually accommodate in the shed that will be provided. And I can see that within a relatively short period of time that this shed will be operating over many days of the week and providing all sorts of community services. In addition to that, I think, as every councillor is aware, although we don't have a shed, we provide a lot of community services today. A lot of community services today. And already, just a few days ago, as you would be aware, with the Walk for Water matter, it was the shed members that provided the traffic management. It was the shed members that provided the barbecue. It was the shed members that did the sausage sizzle. And a good part of the money that is collected for that is going to be donated via the Walk for Water campaign. Now, you tell me what other community groups are playing that role in the community. What other community groups are playing that role in the community? Yes, they are providing a good social outcome for their members. But how wide is that impacting on the community in terms of what the men's shed is currently doing without a shed? Without a shed. With nothing. So what is the opportunity when we get a shed? What is that opportunity? And we know that opportunity is pretty profound, because already we've had people coming to us and suggesting that the men's shed could play an active role in the repair cafe, which is a good idea, in the makerspace concept, which is a good idea, in terms of providing opportunities for women in the community, and particularly single women in the community who need assistance in repairing things and doing things around the home, where they cannot get commercial enterprises to do that, where they need some training and doing all those sorts of things. There is a variety of opportunities here in the community for the men's shed to flourish and to provide not only opportunities for the members of the shed, but great opportunities for the community. So I look forward in anticipation, hopefully not incorrectly, but in anticipation of the council supporting the officer's recommendation in relation to 6.3. In closing, let me just say that I really do appreciate the support of the Mayor and of councillors and of council officers in relation to this, and particularly I'd like to mention Graham Cardy, who actually carved out the first piece of land all those years ago for us. It's not a piece of land that we have now, but if it wasn't for that initiative, this project would have sunk a long time ago. And to Graham Haggard and to Greg Neary, who have been stalwarts of getting this project through at the officer level. So I think this is a really important project for the community. It's a great project, and I look forward to your support in terms of supporting recommendation 6.3.
Thank you. Mr. Yates.
Thank you. Almost my height. Don Yates, 10 Thompson Road, Success Hill. Just a quick one on page 27 to do with item 6.5. It says here, about the sixth paragraph, it says, it should be noted that when a street tree is planted on the verge, it automatically becomes a town asset. Okay, got no problem about that. Okay. Then it goes on and says, as the owner of the asset, and I guess that would be the town, seeing they now own the tree, the person who installed it, now was that the worker or the person who actually donated it, they will be liable for all the claims regarding damage, etc. It does seem a little bit confusing, so maybe a bit of clarity might be helpful.
Yes, I have that paragraph highlighted to seek some clarification on as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Wishart.
I'm here for the men's shed, but I'm also picking up on the planning thing. Am I allowed to speak about an aspect of the planning aspect?
Oh, the MOU, do you mean?
Yes.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yes. At a recent meeting in Success Hill, we discussed the issue of car parking. And there are many people, I feel, within our community who are starting to feel a bit disenfranchised with the direction that planning's going. While we encourage the idea of using public transport, the actual thrill of Australians getting in their car and going to faraway places really often can't involve public transport. It's just not feasible. And I feel that we may need to incorporate this idea of street parking at least, if not in some of the houses as well that are being planned for, to encourage this aspect. I don't think it will change, to be quite honest. The distances we travel are quite vast. I, for one, own a caravan and 2 vehicles. One vehicle to pull the caravan that hardly gets used very much except for that, and another vehicle which is our runaround, and I use that quite frequently around the town to go to hospitals and various other things at the moment. But I'd encourage council to seriously consider this incorporation, this integration of parking and the fact that people will still want their freedom and the capacity to move about.
Just before you move on to the mention, the CEO just wanted to make a point.
Hello, Mr. Wishart. I just wanted to mention that one of the key projects that the town has been working on has been a transport study. So alongside the development of the local planning strategy, it's also been looking at transport, so people's preferred mode of transport, as well as at a local level, the fact that we have 3 train stations, major arterial roads like Guildford Road and so on. So part of the planning discussion is also thinking about people's preferred mode of transport and also access routes in and out of the town. So we're looking at next month bringing a transport study report to council. So that will also look at the car parking issue as well.
Right,
So
thanks
that
for
may
that
be something you're
information.
interested in.
Okay.
And you want to speak to the men's shed item as well?
No, I think Clove's handled that
Okay.
pretty well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone further? Okay, great. In that case, we'll move on to item 6, which is the reports. And I'll just encourage councillors to address their questions through the chair and the CEO, and then we can direct them to the relevant staff. So item 6.1 is the MOU that Nigel just spoke to us about. Are there any further questions that councillors would like to ask of the staff?
So Nigel mentioned that the title of any of the development would transfer to the Department of Communities. I'm not clear about how we maintain our return on investment. If we are giving them the land, if they're paying for the land, if we're can you, and if they're getting the entire title of the development, how does that work for us? I wasn't clear on that.
Certainly. So part of the, when we think about a development, we need to think about what we want to get out of that particular site. So it may be that the land is vested in the, might be state property, but vested in the town, for example, Wilson Street car park. Obviously, part of striking that deal is thinking about what we want out of it and what they want out of it. Obviously, it needs to be a win-win for both parties. Now, what we want out of it could be we want a revenue stream. We want money out of it. But we also want to see, you know, diverse housing, affordable housing. It might be that we want to see mixed-use development, etc. What they want out of it could be a combination of affordable housing, some public housing, etc. So part of, I guess, negotiating what it is we're trying to seek as an outcome, and then thinking about what's in it for the town, the community, for the state, and making sure that that works for all parties. So there's obviously a number of sites that the town owns. There's some that the state owns that are vested in the town, and thinking about what is possible in that regard. Does that?
I guess the detail will come when we flesh out, but it wasn't clear to me how that would happen.
But I guess 85 Old Perth Road, now Brian's not here, but Christian, can you please comment on 85 Old Perth Road? Sorry.
Thank you. I really council it does predate my time at the
Okay.
At the city, at the town. Sorry, the town did own that land, but ownership did transfer to the Department of Housing. But in terms of the exact details around that, I'd have to research that to be able to provide more detailed advice.
Are you happy that's been answered? Any other questions? No? Okay. We'll move on to item 6.2, which is the Smart Resource Waste Tracking System project. Mr. Cardi, is there anything that you wanted to speak to about this? No? Yes?
Yeah, but basically this is a project we're working with Curtin University, and 2 years ago we undertook a project opportunity to do a similar project to this, but we weren't eligible for funding under a different funding arrangement. The funding arrangement we're going to now is has up to about $1.3 million available to us for this project, which we're looking at doing at Curtin University, and it's to work with the business. The whole idea behind this funding opportunity is it's run by private businesses, not by local government or Curtin University or anything like. Private businesses are going to be the forerunners of this project, and in this case we've got about 5 or 6 private businesses involved in it to take on the project, and the project will be to look at opportunities of how people buy waste products such as wrapping plastic, wrapping cardboards, and that. They'll be identified through cameras and through weighing systems of going into a rubbish collection waste vehicle that comes along. They'll be taking pictures of all the rubbish going into those 1,500 odd households. And that information from there will then be going and analysed by Curtin University of the products that are being used, and the people in the 1,500 will then, and the entire Bassendean will then get the opportunity to give feedback on what type of products people within the town of Bassendean are buying that are going straight into landfill. And the education part of this is to try and look at opportunities to stop or change the way they buy their products. And also Curtin University with through the project will be hitting businesses in the area saying these are the products you're selling to residents of the town, and if you can look at changing your products, we can save a fair bit by products going to landfill. So this is to do with the whole that type of aspect. It hasn't been done before. It's initiated through a couple of years ago when we first viewed this project. We've sent letters off to Marcus at Waste Authority, WA, also Waste Authority, and he was quite excited about the opportunity for the town being involved. And I think there's a good prospect us as a town getting a lot out of it, and at a very little cost, only staffing cost to be involved.
Great, thank you. And so that application's been submitted and it's just for council to note.
That's right.
Yep. Are there any questions, Councillor Wilson?
Thank you, Your Worship. So I note in the officer's report it talks about a sample size of 1,500 households, and it says that those households will be selected if and when the study goes ahead. Has there been any discussion to date about whether that would be a geographically contiguous area or whether it would be randomised houses across the town?
1,500 nominated. This was decided through funding application. We can only do that much in a certain amount of time that will cover the cost. The 1,500 has to be in a collective area together, so where the truck that's going to have the weighing system and the radio frequencies cameras in there will be in that area to do it, so it has to be in that area. The reason we haven't nominated anything, because I think it's a good opportunity to come back to council to decide on an area that we want to identify to do, and that we as councillors as a group would think that we get the best effort in the long term for the town.
And so the technology, I'm presuming this is the barcodes, so it would match up the bin to the resident and to the camera, and all of the data would be collected in real time.
That's correct. Basically, it'll come along, they'll be taking pictures of the bin onto the front, they'll go pitchers will go into the bin. A good job to look at for that period of time, but the pitchers will all go showing all the rubbish going in the bin, the identified product. If there are contaminated products going into those bins, and the 3 bins that will be taken into account, then that education project will happen with those people as well. It's not like an audit system, it'll be just more explaining of what the benefit to the town is of working with.
Okay. Will it also collect data on the weight of the rubbish produced by each household?
At the end of the day, this is one of the first local governments that have the ability to weigh how much waste is being collected from the premises.
Okay, so that technology that would be incorporated into the collection trucks. Once that technology is there, would it be possible down the track to include that barcoding technology on all of the bins in the town so that we can get an idea about the weight of waste that's been collected?
Yeah, basically, it's like, and this is where it becomes a private business area. They're developing a chip that will go into the top of the bin. As the chip comes up, it'll recognise the data will recognise that and do the weighing and everything like that. Yes, it is possible to further expand it out through the town. As being one of the first things that the benefit will have is that the funding module will place money with our contractor who's doing the waste. They will get that through a charge through the funding application. All the benefit of that truck being fitted out will come to the town, and we will be the only ones using that in our town.
And so the costing about the chip, is that information going to be made available to us, or will that remain the property of the private proponents of the research?
The data, all the information as data is collected has been designed through these chips, through these IT companies. All that information goes into Curtin, and Curtin will be able to provide that on a monthly basis, all that information to us. The data, something that hasn't been decided, I can't recall which will it be open to everyone, but it'll be free to everyone because it's funding through the government. So if we want to be able to use it somewhere else, because the government are paying for it, that means we should be able to have it. That's, without clarity, that's what I believe it is.
Thank you. And just one last question. The NMRC going to be involved at all in this project, or?
No, this is us, Curtin University, and 5 other businesses.
Thank you.
Councillor Quinton?
Oh, I just wanted to ask if the 1,500 people would be told if they're going to be part of the trial.
Obviously, sorry, not obviously. Yes, they will be. There will be a community consultation process to work out with the best area to identify and those participated.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, item 6.3, this is the design and construction of the men's shed. Questions? Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Worships. I've had the benefit of reading the confidential report. Of course, matters to do with the tender process need to remain confidential. I was wondering if it was able to broadly explain the differences in the build style of the two tenders, of course without divulging any politics.
So Councillor Wilson,
Right.
who would be the best person to?
Mr. Haggett.
Thanks for the question. In fact, I wasn't part of the assessment process, but I'll see if I can provide a response. The tender document actually provided the specifications, quite detailed specifications, and so the responses were all based on a very similar style and build. It was all steel and steel clad design, the build. We articulated that an off-the-shelf modular structure was acceptable. I'm not sure that any of them did respond that that's what they would do. My understanding is that they would be constructing it to spec. But they were all steel and steel clad.
Sorry, I'm not sure if that answered Councillor Wilson's question. because I think there is a lot of disparity between the figures on each of the allocated sections, and it doesn't make sense to me. I'm not a builder, I don't understand these things. So are we absolutely confident that the figures that are being provided, because they vary so wildly?
Indeed, yes. And in fact, we went back as a consequence when the group met. They did raise that query, and I think it was Callan Short, who was one of the panel members, who suggested that he would like some further clarification. And so we went back to all four responders and asked them a series of questions to build confidence that all things had been considered. And the responses came back, and they were quite uniform, the responses that came back. So there was confidence when we met the second time, or when the panel met the second time. They believed that they were in a position where they could provide a recommendation with confidence.
One follow-up question. With regards to the electrics, is three-phase power delivered to the shed a part of the tender requirements, and has that been checked off as part of the tender?
I was looking across at my colleague who is much more au fait at the specs that were put together external of me. But my understanding is that yes, that we've also drawn down on some of the budget already in order to provide services to the site. So where the original budget was 370, when we went out to tender, we discounted the 35 that we'd already spent getting the services to the site, and that was known to the tenderers as well.
Councillor Hamilton?
Am I correct? I'm not sure whether I just want to ascertain that only 2 of the tenders ended up being compliant, is that right? And the other 2 were non-compliant?
Only in that 2 were below the budget that we have, and 2 exceeded the budget. So yes, they were compliant and were assessed. However, 2 came in under the threshold of the budget that we have.
Now the other thing too is that, as Councillor Wilson has pointed out, there's great disparity in some of these figures, which we can't really discuss in great detail because it's confidential, but there's an item there, other, and I'm really curious what other is, given that some people have quoted prices on that and some haven't, so I'm curious about what that other is.
Yeah, thanks, Kid.
Just to answer the first question, when you have everyone that applied for, as a tender, everyone gets evaluated, and you start from the base. So in the first case, the lowest costing was evaluated until we find the right one available to us. So in this case, everyone was evaluated, but the person that organised the final data was still probably the best one that they could find in the evaluation process. When it comes to other, in some cases when you're under a contract, you may have a 10% contingency plan where you can things you do not know what's coming under the ground, or other type of things. In this case, they put that in there just in case there is other options they haven't found in that area. It may not be used, it may be a savings to the town, but in some cases that's usually where the contingency prices are put in other.
Okay, these don't add up to 10%, but move on. Okay.
No, usually 10, some put 15.
Okay, I do have a question. Why was the tender capped, precluding the possibility of a better quality build pending council evaluation?
We knew that what the budget was. We knew that also that the project needed to come in on that budget, and so we informed the responders how much money we had to give them a guide, so that they weren't under any illusion that they could put in any price.
That's highly unusual, is it not?
I wouldn't say it's unusual. It's not necessarily the approach that's taken in all cases, but it's not something that hasn't occurred here in the town before.
Okay. Through the chair, I wanted to know whether the administration are aware that there's been motions passed in the past, resolutions by this council requesting that tender documents be made available prior to advertising. So I'm curious what the status is there with this document, because I don't believe it came before councillors.
Certainly. We're currently receiving some advice on that resolution from Wilga. So I guess certainly that's been a request, but understanding, I guess, the function and role of administration.
I should make myself clear. Apologies. Sorry, I meant before it goes out, not the actual receipted tender applications, but before the tender goes out, the actual composition of what goes out for advertising.
Yeah, so, and I do apologise. So understanding, I guess, the outcomes and the broad requirements, and then translating that into a tender document, and so understanding where along the chain we need to submit that documentation or specifications to council, and what sort of sits within the domain of the administration, if that makes sense. So I understand that particular resolution, so anything above 20,000 to come back to council. So just considering it from a, I guess, what is the domain of the administration versus council. So the clarity is around getting advice on that. So trying to meet council's wishes in terms of transparency and understanding the outcomes and specifications, but also considering what sits within the domain of the administration. So that's effectively the advice that's been sought.
Okay, so I do have another question. I'd like to know what analysis was done by the administration re different types of builds in relation to asset longevity and asset management.
Pass it through to Graham.
Yeah, thank you. Can I say that the decision to go to tender for a steel-clad steel structure was one that has been to council before. So we actually went to the tender specifications based on the instruction that we received from council.
Can I actually just have a subsequent question to that? Because that's not exactly what I asked. What I asked was what analysis was done by the administration re different types of builds in relation to asset longevity and asset management. Now what that means is at some point in time I would assume that there is an analysis of whether a concrete tilt builder would be a better value, dollar value, in relation to longevity than, say, a ColourBond build. So these are the questions that I'm asking, and I personally have never seen anything that tells me what is the best asset for the dollar spent, and I have never seen that.
In the earlier iteration of the project, when we were talking about constructing on the depot site, the preferred construction model was tilt-up, concrete tilt-up, and detailed design was undertaken, and detailed costings were provided on that construction model, which came in at about $1.2, $1.3 million. And it was at that time that there was discussion with council about the preferred model, and it was at that time that the decision was made to go to the steel clad structure. So it was based on experience that we had with this particular project.
I was just going to add, if I may, Mr. Haggett, there had been some analysis and discussions with our own building surveyor and also with Welga, I understand, around the tender specifications and robustness and value for money. Is that
Yes.
right? Do you want to elaborate on that?
Before the tender was finalised, the tender document was finalised, there were a number of filter processes, including one with Wolga, who did an analysis of the document for us and provided feedback on how it could be improved. But we also had an analysis undertaken by a tender expert, a person that who does tenders as well, on ensuring that it was the best quality product that we could produce.
Can I just go back to the initial questions about the variation in the costings that have been provided? So you mentioned that the evaluation panel went back and sought some clarification on some of these items. I just want to be really clear that the panel was satisfied that the allocations that had been made was going to deliver what was required, because it is somewhat concerning, the variation that we're seeing here. So I don't know, Mr. Cardi, whether that's you who was involved in that process or
no. Yes, and that was the principal reason for going back to again confidence. In fact, Mr. Lapham was involved in that process as well. So it was about, particularly from Callum Short, the principal building surveyor, and his level of confidence that that all issues had been addressed within the tender responses, and so the clarification sought provided that confidence.
So Callum had the discussions with the tenderers?
Not directly, no. We put the series of questions back out to all of the respondents, and they were given a couple of days to respond, to submit, and then a second a selection or assessment panel meeting was convened, at which those responses were then considered.
Councillor Quinton?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask about the trees. How many trees are currently earmarked for removal?
Significant tree, or so substantial trees, I think there's about half a dozen.
Okay, 6?
Don't quote me on that.
Okay.
It's
Ish-esque?
It's a number. Yeah, it is a number.
Just wondering, is there space then, if we have 6 trees, how many more trees we could get on the site to be replanted? So if it's going to be a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio,
Yeah.
what could we do there?
Yeah, certainly we will plant as many trees as we're able to on site, but there's also been talk about whether or not we should also be looking at off site and adding additional trees in lieu from there as well.
Okay, so who, because it says here that the men's shed has committed to replacing the tree. Now, we've had many discussions here about quality of trees. So would it not be best for us to choose the trees that go back on the site just to make sure that they are quality trees?
Yeah, so we'd be seeking the builder to provide that within the landscape plan, and to also install the trees as part of the build. But the men's shed have also indicated that they're very keen to ensure that there is shade and canopy is available, so they'll make sure that they look after it. We'll build it into the lease agreement.
Okay, so
indeed.
what I'm really asking though is who is responsible for the trees? Because to me, maybe this is a question for Mr. Stuart Dawkins, that perhaps that we, or Mr. Cardi, that we provide the trees and that the men's shed look after the trees, because then we know that it's a quality tree rather than them just popping down to Bunnings and picking any old tree. So I just want to get clear about trees.
Knowing and understanding the gentleman from the men's shed, I I don't think we'll have any trouble working with them to design what type of trees, the best trees suitable for that area.
Okay.
We can provide those trees if that's what council wants.
Can I just get some clarification, because something you just said, you indicated that the builder will be responsible for the landscaping plan and replacing
Yes.
trees, but then I'm hearing something different over here.
Landscape, we provide that.
Sorry?
So yeah, so as part of the requirements of the tender, a landscaping plan is required, and so the trees will be part of the landscaping plan as far as I'm aware.
And have our requirements for trees been specified as part, so that they know what we require in a landscaping plan? Like, how has that been described to the tenderer?
So
That I'm
may I
aware of.
just, there are two key controls here. One is the development approval, so we can specify in the development approval what our expectation is, the standard, etc., how many trees. The other is the licensing agreement. So we've got two key controls here in which we can manage the outcome that we're after. So if we're removing 6 trees, we can specify what we want as part of the landscaping plan in the development approval, whether we're providing the trees or the men's shed or the builder's providing the trees, but also in the licensing agreement. So I think whatever the outcome is that we're seeking, I think we have that enshrined in those two controls.
Thank you.
Hamilton?
Could I, through the chair, would I be able to ask that a schematic be provided to councillors before the OCM showing the build and what trees will be removed because of the build? Because I'm not entirely sure that it's only 6 trees. So I'd like to actually visually be able to see that. And it shouldn't be too difficult to do an overlay of the actual topography of the land with the actual build.
Other questions? No? Do you have any further, Councillor Hamilton? No? Okay, thank you. 6.4, the Slibandari Park Wetland Concept Plan. I know Councillor Mikachuk submitted some questions in advance. Who's speaking to this one?
Mr. Dawkins.
Did you want to provide a summary at all?
Yes, happy to. Councillors, there was a workshop that was held with Coterra Environmental a couple of weeks ago where there was a presentation. A copy of that presentation is attached to the agenda. Councillor Mikachuk has asked me a few questions, and I'll just look at those questions for the moment. So, there it is, sorry. So, there was a couple of questions that were asked. One was in regards to the floating wetland and the cost and logistics involved in maintaining them. There was a report that was provided to the River Parks Committee, and that was also provided to Council in regards to the costings associated with each of the elements for the 3 different concepts. I don't have those cost with me tonight. However, I can direct you to which page that will be in the council portal, which you hopefully that report is. In regards to the maintenance of that, again, that information I don't think was actually included in the assessment in regards to the maintenance. But one of the issues associated with the floating wetland was, of course, that Bindari Park does dry out over the summer months, and there was concern in regards to the wetland, of course, landing on the solid ground, and then the potential reeds or rushes that were planted, and that would then potentially take root, and then the issues associated when water went back into the wetland about that refloating again, and there was so that's one of the reasons why that was recommended to be taken out of the proposal. The next question was in regards to one moment, please. The next question was in regards to the modelling and the hydrology assessments required to modify the wetland in accordance to the River Parks Committee's proposal. At the workshop, Coterra advised that if the council wanted to go down the road of undertaking this additional assessment, that we'd need to initially speak to the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, Department of Water and Environmental Regulations, the Department of Environmental Protection Authority, and also the Department of Fisheries sorry, one moment. To look at the issues associated with acid sulfate soils, dewatering requirements, potential for contaminants in the wetland that's already there, especially from the stream bed excavation works that may be required, and also there might be a requirement for us to look at future flooding, because the current option 1 proposal that's presented to council is basically doing the minimal changes, but incorporating 4 biofilters, 3 new swales and gross pollutant traps, and some paths which are proposed to be modified, which would manage the cost but also reduce the impact on the wetland. So the next question was what would be the estimated cost to undertake further modelling, and is there funding currently allocated in the budget? Council did allocate $10,000 in the current budget. That funding is still available. However, based on the information I've just provided earlier to the earlier question, I would suggest that $10,000 would be close to being enough for the environmental assessments that would need to be undertaken. I don't have an estimate of that. We'd need to go to all those various departments, find out exactly what they want, and then go out and get an order of magnitude. So that's a task in itself, to go out and get those details. I think I've made that respond to the questions.
Yeah, I think they're the main ones, thank you. I mean, maybe or not, it might be possible to just ask the consultant in regards to, I was just thinking rough ballpark figure in the interest of good decision making, to just be able to, you know, was it in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, rather than approach every department. Maybe Coterra might have an idea on that. But,
so if we could seek just a ballpark figure between now and the meeting.
Yeah, just for an understanding, because obviously the committee was conscious that there might need to be further modelling. There was some money put aside. I completely appreciate that might be inadequate, and also there was some doubt about whether those modifications would add to functionality or improved water quality. But I think just to be able to make a good decision, it would, if in a simple way there would be a figure could be provided, I think that would be helpful.
And just on that point in regards to the benefits, the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, there's a letter that's attached to the officer's report, states that as the proposed future inclusions of the Bassendean wetland plan are unlikely to result in significant enhanced water quality improvement and risk worsening water quality if not appropriately managed, the department recommends against exploring this option further, particularly at the expense of progressing works proposed in the Bassendean wetland development stage 1. So they're basically indicating to us that you can proceed down this road, but the cost benefits may not play out.
Thank you.
Councillor Quinton, then.
Yeah, my question follows on from that then. If we do go down this road and decide to spend 18 months and potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars on all of these assessments, and we need to get a environmental management plan under the EPA, and with the advice then from the department, after all of that, the EPA could turn around and say no anyway, couldn't they?
Yes, that's the indication we've had from Coterra, that could be a potential risk to the town.
Yeah.
Councillor Hamilton?
Through the chair, this is, I did send an email to Mr. Stuart Dawkins this afternoon regarding the potential to apply for a grant. It's the Community Stewardship Grant. Closes on the 10th of June. Up to $450,000 is available on that grant. So I'm just...
Yeah, thank you.
Because this is a very expensive project.
Yes, thank you for the question. At this stage, just in regards to the timing of this work, at this stage, we haven't applied for a grant for Bindaring Park because what we need to do firstly is to, of course, have council put this proposed, whatever plan for council decides on, put that out to the community, get that plan to be endorsed by council after a period of consultation. Then once we've got that endorsed, then we need to prepare detailed drawings and specifications, and then they could go, and at that time we could apply for grant funding. So there's kind of a bit of a timing issue in regards to the works. So at this stage we haven't applied for grant, but we've certainly got it in our register that we will provide that in the future.
I'm just... Okay, I understand what you've said. I'm just concerned that the community would, if we are going to proceed with this project, the community would like us to save money wherever possible.
Absolutely.
And certainly, you know, that's a significant grant, and I'm not entirely sure that grants of that value will come along very regularly. So I'm putting it out there that I would really hope that somehow or other there might be potential for us to take advantage of that. But moving on, I have another question.
Kat, just before you move on.
Sorry, Councillor Hamilton, I was just going to mention that considering grant funding and other opportunities for funding is something that we regularly consider at our corporate management meetings. So we now have built a register, and we're actually tracking a number of grant opportunities that are available and discuss them on a regular basis. So we do have visibility of this one. It's just understanding, I guess, the requirements and where we're at in our planning as well. So most of them either require a concept plan if it's a, you know, like for example, if we're seeking election funding or commitment, a concept plan in the minimum is required. But for this one, I understand a more detailed diagram.
Well, yes, at this stage, I mean, the grant, as you've indicated, the grant closes very shortly. We haven't even gone out to public comment, or council haven't endorsed this plan at this stage. So, yes, so that's the stage. So we don't have detailed drawings, so the grant funding might, a criteria would be that you at a particular stage, and we're not even at that stage. Now we're close to it.
Okay, I do have another question.
So
Sorry.
Would you mind clarifying that particular grant so that we can be absolutely certain that we're not able to apply with the concept plan that we have?
Most definitely.
I do have another question, which may be more for perhaps not be answered here, but there's been much discussion about publishing publicly how much a project potentially could cost in public documents, and so I note that there's indicative costs publicly available in this document. And if this is going to go out to tender, I have some uncertainty about how this pans out in the tender process. So I would just ask if perhaps the administration might come to some position on that.
Certainly. Thank you.
That's it.
Excuse me, I could probably make the other issue. Once we've got some of the detailed drawings done, it might be a staged process that council may like to pursue. You know, there might be people might think, oh, let's do the swales and get some of the swales done initially, so that could be 1 year. Another year could be installing the network of paths in there. You know, so you could do it in a staged process. You don't need to necessarily do everything at one time. So.
I might add that grant is over 3 years if you want to continue the project over 3 years. So yes, we could do it in the stage program. But anyway, I'm sure other councillors have other things to ask.
Councillor Brown.
Through the chair, page 22 under financial considerations. The cost of $5,500 is simply to amend the plan. Is that right? Has it ever been put to the consultants to absorb some of that cost? When you consider part of that, half of what I'm assuming, is to make changes to the floating wetland, which was, excuse the pun, was never an idea that was going to float. Everybody involved with Bindari Park and every resident surrounding it knows that annually that dries out and any floating wetland is going to take root. So it was a mistake on their part. It showed a lack of environmental scan. They've gone down, it almost seems they've gone down there when it's full of water and said this is what we're going to do. So has that ever been put to the consultants that they absorb at least some of that $5,500 cost, because it was a mistake, in my view.
Something perhaps we can take on notice and have a look at.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I take councillors and officers to page 19 of the agenda, and some officer comment that's been provided about an alternative motion that was put forward to the River Parks Committee, specifically points C and point E, which discuss incorporating as an option the reconnection of the wetland at Highland Street and the removal of the causeway. And at E, provide options for the inclusion of an adjustable weir at the current weir site under the first boardwalk, or elsewhere to maintain the wetland's freshwater ecological character and to prevent the intrusion of salt due to rising river levels associated with climate change. Now, following the presentation by Kotira, I had a meeting with the Friends of Bindari group who maintain in their opinion that those two features are desirable. I was just wondering if we could have some discussion about why it was either not the officer's recommendation or not the consultant's recommendation to proceed with those two amendments.
In regards to Highland Street, there's been previous reports provided to council in regards to the level of contamination of that causeway that crosses the wetland at the moment. And in response, my earlier response just talked about some of the reports that would need to be undertaken and the potential level of contamination that might occur to other areas of the wetland, and that those would need to be managed in an equitable way. And so that's partly in answer. The other issue was in regards to that the wetland in the upper area of what would be the west side of that causeway. Currently, it has a level of isolation between the lower section, which has a saline, which is more saline, and the other one is a fresh water wetland. So there's from an overall perspective, you think, oh, let's just connect the whole lot so it all they're all connected. But the consultant was saying, hey, look, there are some environmental benefits of having the upper wetland, because it's fresh water, and the other areas it has salt water inundation. And then you've got all the costs associated with doing the reports. So it basically came down to those two issues. And in regards to the item E, sorry, may I just read that one more time?
So E is the discussion of
the weir. It's actually a similar type of argument again that the consultant provided, saying that the area to the north is more fresh water, and this weir would require excavation into the soil in order for it to be stable, which means you have to do an acid sulfate soil assessment, you have to do contamination assessments. So there's a whole range of assessments that need to be undertaken, and we don't know whether there would be a cost benefit of achieving that. So the weir idea, I don't know where the consultant doesn't have any scientific assessment or water hydrology assessment to make a recommendation at this stage, and so again, cost benefits, we couldn't identify what they might be at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Just a follow-up question to that. So it was made abundantly clear to me at my meeting with the Indarian group that they maintain that putting a weir in would stop salt rising up past that, and would then also maintain a freshwater level year round, effectively acting as a dam. I imagine that at our council meeting next week they will come and ask questions in that regard. So just wondering if it's possible to get maybe some more detail just around those 2 points, the interplay between the removal of the causeway and the weir in advance of the council meeting, so that we can be prepared for that discussion.
Councillor Hamilton.
Following on from Councillor Wilson's questions, I would also like to know if the salt content is in fact one of the prime reasons for the negative effect on the endemic trees in that area, because you'll note from the freshwater side that the trees are quite well and healthy. However, on the other side, which appears to be suffering from salt residue, there's significant degradation of the trees. So I would like to know, not now, but before the OCM, whether that salt content is actually negatively affecting the vegetation and the trees in that particular first area.
Anything further on this one?
I just wanted to ask, I assume there would be a cost involved in the consultant being available to answer these questions directly next week, if that would aid in, yeah, okay.
Certainly, yeah, there would be a cost.
Yes, there would be. I don't know the exact cost, but we could potentially, I think it would be probably a similar price than what we pay for the presentation to the workshop. So we could contact them again, see whether they're prepared.
And I'm not suggesting that that should happen. No, I was more just flagging something in the aid of providing information.
Certainly,
That's
I think some of the questions that Councillor Wilson raised, I think I do recall the consultant touching on, and I'm not sure whether you were at the presentation, but I recall some comments along the lines of, particularly with the causeway, because the results are unpredictable at this stage. We know it's contaminated, why would we upset nature? But I think coming from somebody with a environmental scientific background would have much more credibility than myself.
Yeah, or at the very least perhaps an expansion in the Office of Comment about any of the consequences that might flow from removing the causeway and incorporating the weir.
Thank you.
Can I add to that? I'm not entirely sure that we need a presentation. I'm
I'm
sure
not saying that
an email commentary could be provided on some of these questions.
Okay, happy to move on? Okay, 6.5, which is the draft verge treatment policy and the draft verge maintenance policy. Is this yours now?
Yep.
Yep. Would you mind just speaking briefly as to the changes that are being proposed compared to the current policy?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so as the report suggests, the purpose of this report is for Council to endorse a public consultation of the new draft verge treatment policy, the verge maintenance policy and the verge treatment policy. The main aspects of the policy were to encourage planting, encourage ownership of the verge and encourage planting in the verge from the residents. It also allows us to plant our own trees in amongst those plantings as well under the urban forest strategy. We do, in answer to Don Yates' question before, we do maintain all liability in the road reserve, so it would be our liability if any trees, branches falling or anything like that, so we need to maintain them. We need to ensure they're compliant, so there's been a will from council and the community to have different verge plantings in the verge, and There have been planter boxes, small libraries, chairs, other types of verge treatment. So the policy allows that to occur. If they do want to, and the basis of the verge policy is also to try and remove the approval process, so to provide guidelines for the community of what they can and can't do. If they do want to undertake some plantings which are outside of the guidelines we're presenting, we can go and assess that and make some recommendation to that as well. The other components are also to try and maintain clear pedestrian and access way through the verge. So if we do have members of the public trying to walk down the street, that they can do so. People can open their car doors on the side of the road without running into limestone blocks. So there is a level of risk that we've assessed through this policy. We have gone to LGIS on those risks and got those assessed and endorsed. So we've gone through quite a process to try not to over complicate the matter, try not to be too controlling, but at the same time try to provide some clear guidelines that meets what the community is desiring of the verges.
Great, thank you. I've just got a few questions. So first of all, in relation to the comment Mr. Yates made around this paragraph on page 27, I'm still not entirely sure what it's saying, because it says it should be noted that when a street tree is planted on the verge, it automatically becomes the town's asset.
Yep.
So I'm not sure whether this is referring to trees that residents plant on their verge, or whether it's just referring to trees that the town plants on verges.
Yeah, so I think the paragraph is confusing. I would remove the person who installs it. So the second sentence could read, as the owner of the asset, being us, will be liable for any claims regarding damage to infrastructure, including power lines, private property due to root growth.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. So my next question would be, this current policy does not allow residents to plant any trees on their verge.
Yeah, it does.
Can you point where that is? I was having trouble reading it because where does it say?
So, for example, under the local law talks about the permissible verge.
So the next one's the next agenda item.
So the policy also picks that up.
Yeah.
Under permissible verge treatment.
It may well be here, but I was just finding it difficult because of all the edited documents and going between the two.
So, for example, permissible verge treatments of the planting and maintenance of a garden, acceptable.
Can you point me to where you are,
plants, water-wise gardens, eligible fruit, eligible vegetables, raised garden beds, a clear site visibility is maintained at all times for a person using or abutting the thoroughfare, low-growing shrubs, where no footpath. So it talks about all the permissible things that are allowed to occur in that section. It talks about setbacks and alignments and dial before you dig in regards to the requirements for plantings, and also advises in regards to raised garden beds and the distances that they need to be away. So I suppose it hasn't specifically said it, but it talks about plants and vegetation.
Yeah, so that was what I was getting at. So I know we've had various discussions around obviously the raised garden beds and so on, but we also had discussions around what our policy was going to be about trees and residents planting trees, whether that be a street tree that aligns with our requirements, or whether it be residents who are wanting to plant like fruit trees and things like that. I'm just not sure, reading this, what we're saying.
So the council doesn't have a policy as such in regards to the type of trees, but for example, recently we just received a request from somebody to plant a woody pear, and so we basically just said, look, there is no requirements, but this is the alignment you need to plant the tree at. So and this is so that would be kind of falling under the permissible birch treatments area under our local law and its current policy in regards to vegetation. If the council wishes to add street trees, you could do that if you feel as though that's necessary, but it's kind of...
I just feel that if it's unclear for me, it's going to be unclear for members of the public who are also trying to make sure that they're doing, putting treatments on their verge that are compliant, especially if we're saying we're removing the need to have a approval process if it's compliant with our policy. If we haven't got something in there which clearly articulates what is and isn't, because we're not mentioning trees here, we're not saying whether they can or can't, and if we're saying that possibly we can, but
council have a criteria that you're asking us to go away and select trees. So what criteria do you want residents to use? Do you want residents to use that same criteria in regards to trees being planted, or are you prepared to allow them to plant anything?
I guess that's a decision that council would have to make, but I guess I'm just pointing out that we haven't actually clearly had a position on this in the new policy. If we're going to put a new policy out, it'd be really good to be clear what our expectations are. I'm not sure if others feel the same way, but when I read it, that was what stood out to me.
Can I just suggest, given there's a bit of to be arbitrary, what's a shrub and what's a tree, that if council wants to consider that, they might think about heights rather than, anyway, a discussion for another time. But also those terms can be quite subjective and difficult to give guidance on.
And just in relation to my email this afternoon, I see the point on there that I missed earlier about the little libraries and the seating. So sorry, I just missed that earlier when I asked the question. Councillor Quinton.
Yes, thank you. Would I be able to get more detail about this 2 metre buffer and how that came about and the reasons for it, and how big is an average verge now? How big is an average verge?
Where's the 2 metre buffer?
So it's if there is no footpath.
Yep.
Where there is no footpath, I've got a page number. No, I don't have a page number. Clear access of a minimum width of 2 metres along the part of the verge immediately adjacent to the curb road edge.
2.C. Yep.
Yes. How did we arrive at 2 metres, and how big are verges? How big are verges is my first question.
Verges vary greatly. Most of the verges around Bassendean would be much larger than 4 metres wide, I guess. But they do, in high density areas, like say Fremantle, those areas, the verges can be quite narrow. And so those verges are pretty much designated as access ways. So it's important that we have an access. So how does the 2 metres come about? As an access way. So years ago, the minimum access was probably about 1.2, where you see a lot of footpaths around Bassendean as 1.2. Those standards have now increased, and it depends on your volume of traffic, number of people, the usage of the area, on what width you would generally achieve. So 2 metres is probably a nominal amount. Not many footpaths are less than 1.8 these days, so 2 metres is sort of like a good average. PSPs, they're now pushing for those to be over 3, over 3.5. So it's like if 2 people were walking down the street, or if a woman's walking down, if someone's walking down with a pram, or someone in a wheelchair or the like, then you want a decent amount of access to get through. So obviously officers would have judged that reasonably, but 2 metres is seen as a good average to give.
Has it ever been applied that it could be a percentage? And I know that's ambiguous because of everyone's verge, but 2 metres is a lot when we're trying to encourage people to embrace transforming their verges, and then we say, oh no, but you can only plant up to here, people are they're not going to feel any kind of ownership if we suddenly take all of that space away from them. And generally, I mean, this is just me speaking, but if I was walking with a pram, I wouldn't go up on the verge, onto someone's verge, and walk on their mulch anyway. I'd probably just stay on the road. But
can I just clarify, is the point of the 2 metres for future provision of a footpath?
It could be, but it depends on the road, it depends on the area. So if we want to implement a policy where we're not trying to tie the community and the organisation up with approvals, then it becomes very difficult, I think, to give it a percentage, almost impossible. Would you say 50%? Obviously not. Would you say 10%? Maybe so, but if the verge is narrow, then 10% doesn't become very much. If the road, if it's a cul-de-sac, you'd be quite comfortable to walk down the road in a cul-de-sac, but if it's another type of road, you might not feel so comfortable, and other people might not feel so comfortable. So we're trying to sort of, I suppose, make it in a way that's reasonable for residents and for officers to apply. So there's those things that we could consider, but we might be overcomplicated.
Okay, my other question comes to the removal of any non-compliant verge treatments, and I think this might be something that maybe other councillors might want to consider, but if it were to, how does it work at the moment if there is a non-compliant verge treatment? Do we just go in and bulldoze it over? Is that up to you guys?
Basically, we have a compliance officer who identifies the problem with the verge, and they'll go out there and discuss with the resident if they're home. If they're not, then we provide them with a letter. We provide that letter up to 3 times to say, you know, we want some comment coming back, and then it's a further education. And if they still don't do it, then we come back to council and say this is what we're going to do.
That was my question. Does it come back to council? Can it be our decision?
If you want, yeah. That's what it comes back.
Yep, okay. And the only other point I wanted to make is that there's inconsistency between the subjective of the verge treatment and your verge treatment. So I think that needs to be cleaned up a little bit. Sometimes it says the, and sometimes it says your, and it's very clear that it is not their verge. If we could have that fixed up before next week. Thanks.
Councillor Hamilton?
Following on from the comments that Councillor Clinton has asked, it occurs to me that in our streets we have different grades of streets. Obviously we have main thoroughfares and we have back streets and cul-de-sacs. So I'm not entirely sure if there's, with that 2 metre distance, whether there's potential to play with that depending on whether it's a main street or not. So, you know, there may be potential there to put something in that it doesn't apply in smaller back streets.
This is what I'm trying to get at. This is what I'm trying to get some advice on, is that, for instance, Barton Parade has no footpath on either side. It's a very quiet street. You can always see if there's a car coming from either end. I always walk on the road when I'm walking down that street, whether I'm walking or pushing a pram or whatever, because it just wouldn't make sense to keep going up onto someone's verge. So in that instance, and there are people that have got their verge treatments all the way to the curb. So this is what I'm asking your advice on, is what leeway can we have that draws a line in the sand, but at the same time enables people to have that ownership over their verge? So that's what I'm trying to get at.
I'm not meant to ask questions.
No. So perhaps we take that one on notice.
Okay, thank you.
I was just going to say, you know, potentially if there's a footpath already down the street, obviously that's that's accessible for everybody. So
Yeah.
in those particular cases, it might be, council might see that as being acceptable public access, safe access off the road. On a busy road where, most of our main arterial roads through the town have all got footpaths. So it's really our local access roads or local distributor roads which we might be concerned of. And in those cases, council's got a plan in place to put footpaths down those roads. There's a long-term plan. So maybe that's something that we can come back to council with a little bit of a refinement on the policy for you next week. And I just maybe if we can just seek some clarification from council in regards to the trees, what you want to do with that. Thinking that council have advised staff of a criteria that you would like to apply when we are buying trees and planting trees. Do you want to apply that same criteria for when residents just decide they want to put a tree in the ground? So they could go do anything they like, but you're actually applying to staff and saying to staff, this is a criteria. So that's maybe something you could probably provide some feedback to us on.
Just on the trees, I had another question. In the draft policy, so I think this is the verge treatment policy on the second page. Down near the bottom, so just above the application, it says street tree planting should be in accordance of the adopted street tree policy. We don't have an adopted street tree policy, do we?
No, sorry. We've actually removed that last month before we did.
Sorry?
No, you're quite correct. We do not have a street tree master plan any longer.
Okay, but master plan has been crossed out and it now says street tree policy.
Yes, we do have street tree policy. We have a street tree planting policy and removal and replacement policy.
But our current street tree planting policy doesn't reflect the current specifications for trees that council has recently adopted. Okay. Other questions? Okay. 6.6, so following on, it's the review of the local law activities on thoroughfares and trading in thoroughfares. So this relates to the previous item. Did you want to speak to this as well?
Yes, so the update of the review of the local law activities on thoroughfares and trading in thoroughfares and public places. So that's due to be reviewed every 8 years. So we've done our review. I think the last one was in about 2011. So we've gone through that, reviewed it. We've made various changes, particularly around the verge treatments and the verge policies, but also amended some of our infringement amounts and fines, and also the rest of the admin staff have gone through and reviewed their components, whether it's in regards to building or planning or the like. So we've done a review of the local law.
Can I just ask, on page 37 of 40, it's the prescribed offences. There are a couple of things I just wanted to ask about. So 2.1c has an offence to plant other than grass or a ground cover, contrary to the local law. So is that something we need to amend to align with the policy that's being proposed? Do you see where I'm?
Yeah.
Yep. And the other one I wanted to ask about was 2.1g, which is removal of tree on thoroughfare or verge. And it's a bit unclear on my copy, but I think the modified penalty being proposed is $440. What have we been doing with does that apply when a tree is poisoned or there's some other damage done as well? Is that what we've been, is this only when people are actually prosecuted? Other questions? Okay. 6.7, Councillor Brown, you have a proximity interest. Councillor Mitchell?
Yes, I have a couple of questions on this one. The first one being, obviously there's some speculation about why the fence remains in place and it being in regards to safety. I was curious about whether a risk assessment had been done on the risk to public safety and whether that might inform whether the fence needed to remain.
I'll answer that. The temporary fence which was installed, there wasn't a formal risk assessment that was undertaken at the time back in 2006, but there was certainly an evaluation that was undertaken that kind of looked at the escarpment and saw that there was some cliff faces there. There was one section which collapsed at one stage. There was also quite a lot of, before the works commenced on site, there was also a lot of people scrambling up and down the escarpment to gain access to the foreshore. There was fishing people and just residents. And so as part of the works that were undertaken, there was improved access that was provided to the residents in the area. So at the most southern end, there was a boat ramp that was provided. Oh, sorry, boat ramp, a kayak ramp, should I say, that provided at the southern end. And about the mid-block area, there was some steps that were provided down to the beach. And then at the other end, at the French Street end, there was where the steps are, there was the Roy Hookway platform that was provided. So those three areas were provided to improve public access to the river and to try and manage people scrambling up and down the escarpment, which was doing a considerable amount of damage. So to answer your question, there wasn't a risk assessment done, but there was certainly an evaluation that was undertaken and identified the potential public risk of somebody injuring themselves should they at night time or something like that, should they kind of get too close to the edge. And there was an image that was produced back in 2006 just to kind of give the residents some type of indication of vegetation and how it grows and how it, various levels of vegetation would grow. And it did show, that initially there's a level of view that would be obscured and that would increasingly occur, and then that would get up, and then there would be, potential views or glimpses through to the river. But obviously that's a static image, and it's not that's not how vegetation grows. So what's occurred is that we have reseeding, regeneration, and so we've got this dynamic, I suppose, site where you've got shrubs which have grown up, you've got new trees, seedlings that have also germinated, they're growing up. So you've got this a level of obscurity of the views being obscured, and there have been regeneration of the acacias, as indicated in the report as well. So if council wish to remove any of that vegetation, we do need to get a permit. We can't just
my question was just in regards to...
So can I just follow up on the question about the fence, Councillor Mikitsch, because I understand what you've just explained. I guess this has arisen because there are residents on that street who feel like they were told one thing and have had a different outcome. Whether that was intentional or not isn't really the point. It's the fact that they feel like whether it was the town or our contractors has delivered something different from what their expectations were. And we want to promote trust with our community, and I guess we need to try and find a way to re-establish that trust with this group of people. I'm interested to know why the fence was described as temporary when we knew that there were cliffs there from the very beginning, and that now that's the reason being given for it not being able to be removed.
That's how the Swan Trust or now the new Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, that's how they described it within their permit to install it.
And do you know the reason for that?
Well, I suppose, ultimately the fence might not be there, and we could remove it if we wish to do so. Mm-hmm. It's temporary as in length of time is up to council, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm just concerned that, you know, the recommendation that's been put here that suggests removing trees is not actually addressing the underlying issue, which is the communication that occurred way back then, which, you know, most of us weren't even involved with. But it doesn't negate the fact that we've got a group of residents who feel like, you know, there's some damage being done to that relationship. In terms of the fence, and Councillor Mixture asked about a risk assessment, would it be possible for us to have a look at that fence now and do that risk assessment at this point and determine whether some, all of the fence is still required?
I think that would be absolutely essential before we did before council did anything. That there was a full assessment undertaken. So that wouldn't be able to occur between now and next week.
No, that's fine.
But I think that would be critical to moving forward. To look at the site and to make a determination as to what, if you did happen to remove some portions of fence, then how do you prevent, or how do you manage people not going around that and getting to other areas which are then potentially unsafe. So that's we would probably in that process have some discussions with local government insurance services to work with the officers of the town, and we can bring back a report to council on that.
Okay. There's also a note in the report about 3 species of trees that were included, and you mentioned the acacia. Do you know what the other 2 were that were planted?
So I think it actually mentions those acacia saligna.
I think it just mentions the one, but I may have missed it.
I think I read it somewhere actually.
That's very large.
Could have self-seeded.
Okay, that might be the eucalyptus rudis. Anyway, I just wanted to flag, I'll be intending on putting forward an alternative motion for this, seeking the risk assessment for the fence, but also seeking for the town to contact those affected residents with an explanation and trying to, you know, in an effort to reset that relationship and so on. So just for the benefit of other councillors.
I have another question. Sorry.
Yeah. Councillor Hamilton.
First. Oh, thank you. Just after having a stroll and having a look at the site today, I was wondering, are there plans for, I know weed control still takes place there, but obviously there were some original like erosion control measures put in place, there's some jute matting, there's some bank stabilisation. You know, I'm aware that that deteriorates over time. Are there any plans to like bolster that or address the ongoing erosion just that happens over time?
Yes, we do. In fact, Jeremy receives a report from environmental people and making recommendations in regards to what treatments we can do. So we have gone back on a number of occasions. Council's allocated funding to go back for us to go and to re-bolster those areas. And we are seeing progressively some improvements in regards to, because there was a huge sections which were under-eroded quite considerably, and so that means the trees were consistently falling into the river. We've been able to, you know, kind of slow that down quite a lot by some of the treatments that we've been undertaking. And you know, it's an ongoing, it's a dynamic river system, and so we need to continually go in there and undertake this work.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely appreciate that.
Councillor Hamilton?
Following on from the discussion or questions going on here, if we are looking at the fence and the risk assessment of taking it away and what have you, could we potentially at the same time look at, if the fence was going to be removed, something that would provide more of a natural barrier, i.e. low set growth type hedging or things like that? Can we potentially look at alternatives to the fence? Because obviously one of the primary complaints that I'm hearing is that the fence was always said to be temporary and it's now permanent. So if there is a risk of some description, can we potentially look at alternative methods that might repel people in a natural way but not have massive trees growing? Yeah.
Look, yes, potentially we can look at vegetation, which is going to be undesirable to kind of walk through. But of course, we're all aware that people tend to skirt around that vegetation in order to get there to their desired, location. So, I think in theory, yes, that's possible, but it needs to be carefully considered because people can skirt around vegetation to get to where they want to, and then if they happen to drop off a sharp edge, that could be a risk that we haven't considered.
Councillor Quinton?
Just following on from that, what would be the liability on us between a fence and a hedge?
I think that's probably some advice we'd need to get from local government insurance services.
I would assume it'd be better if we had a fence. Anyway,
Not
my other
necessarily.
question would be that Syrinx have said that they were not able to comment on the condition of the erosion control. If we had to go down the path of removing trees anyway, would we not have to compile a report, and would that have a cost attached to it?
Can you just reframe your question, please?
So Syrinx are not able to comment on the condition of erosion control, so they don't know. And do we know?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Okay.
So we have a because this work occurred 6 years ago, and we've kind of gone back to Syrinx. The Syrinx haven't met since the handover of the project. That they had I think a 12-month or 2-year maintenance period that they had to look after the vegetation for, and then once they had finished that job, that they were out of there, they haven't gone back there. So the town of Bassendean has taken over the maintenance responsibility. So that's why they're not able to comment on the erosion issues. But I just made a comment earlier to Councillor Mikic advising that we do go in there and do assessments, and Council has in the past provided funding to go back and re-bolster some of the work that requires ongoing maintenance. It's just a natural thing. The brush matting which we have to install, that's been re-bolstered, and additional plantings have occurred regularly. Rock work has been installed under some of the excavations where other blowouts have occurred. So we've kind of gone in on a regular basis.
So a more detailed report would have to come back to us anyway, which would just be staff time.
I would have to check with Jeremy. He's not back until next week, but I think we've probably got a report for this year, because we would be using that as part of our maintenance budget.
Okay.
So I can speak to Jeremy or Ken tomorrow and find out whether we've received that report already.
Anything further? Thanks, Simon. Okay, 6.8, Chief Executive
Bob Brown back in.
Oh yes, we need Bob back in.
The discussion was had about pictures of the
I didn't have issue with Sarah. I just want to say that.
Yeah, I'll just
in
make
terms
a
of
message.
we manage a lot of
it's all contrivance because it's about a couple of people's view of the water. I mean, that's the real issue.
I know, I
The
just
rest
wanted to
of
tell
the
you
issue.
what my noise wasn't in regards to Sarah asking a question. So I'm just making notes for the office.
People should be honest about what they're being about, rather than making up other things. And it's not really about that. It's all about the rules.
So we're on item 6.8. This is the CEO's 6-month highlights report, and Peter's just going to give us a little bit of a summary.
Thank you, Renee. The report is primarily for transparency purposes, not only for council but also for the community. Based on my first 6 months here at the town, it really seeks to highlight I guess some of the fundamental building blocks that I've been focusing on over that period, starting with an environmental scan and trying to get a sense of what's important to the town, council, community, and then putting in place some of those changes that will put us in a stronger position going forward. Haven't sought to comment on specific projects, but really building the foundations and trying to reorientate the agency. I'm not sure if there's any specific questions.
You're off the hook. So thank you, Peter. 10.9 is the determinations made by Principal Building Surveyor. 10.10 is... 6.10, thank you, sir. Development Services. Item 7 is notices of motion, which we will address later. Item 8 is confidential business. So, Mr. Lappin, can I ask you to turn off the recording? Thank you for being here this evening.